folks, Charlie here, VE7CQE, with another episode of Ham Talk. This one, how does an antenna tuner actually work? Well, strictly speaking, antenna tuners are really misnamed because they don't actually tune the antenna. Okay, it's not despite its name, it doesn't actually tune an antenna. What it does is it matches the complex impedance of the transmitter to that of the input end of the feed line going to the antenna and the antenna itself. The input impedance of the transmission line is usually different than the impedance of the feed line if the impedance of the antenna at the other end doesn't match that line's characteristic impedance. So if your antenna is 450 ohms and your feed line is 50 ohms, they obviously don't match. The consequence is that you get RF going back along the coaxial toward the radio. Now, if what a tuner does is it takes that impedance mismatch and it introduces its own capacitance and or impedance into that signal coming from the feed line and antenna to the transmitter, so that it changes that and introduces its own, so that the transmitter sees 50 ohms, and when it sees 50 ohms, it's quite happy and yeah, everything's cool, and then it allows full power to then go out through the tuner, out through the feed line to the antenna. But what happens to that RF? Well, with an antenna tuner, really I shouldn't call it an antenna tuner, so I'm not going to. Let's just say your tuner. Your tuner will stop that RF from getting back into the radio, and we'll bounce it back through the feed line to the antenna again, and it goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until all of it is radiated out by the antenna. This happens so quickly that you wouldn't even notice it. It is extremely fast. So the tuner actually allows all of the power that is being sent out from the radio to be radiated by the antenna. That's simple. How it does this? Well, it does it through way of being a sort of, in most cases, a transformer of sorts that transforms the impedance of the antenna and feed line system, takes that and then transforms it so that the radio itself sees 50 ohms, and it transforms what's coming out of the radio at 50 ohms to that of the feed line and antenna system, and out it goes. Does it to actually tune the antenna? No, it doesn't. It doesn't change the impedance of the antenna whatsoever. It's a misnomer to think it does, and that's why my first episode said that it lies to the radio, because in a way it does, and in a way it doesn't. It tells the radio that hey, everything's cool, it's all 50 ohms over here, when really it isn't. But it does take the radio signal and transforms it to an impedance, or that allows all of the power then to be radiated out through the antenna. Where should you put your tuner? Well, the best place for a tuner is always as close to the antenna as possible. That way it is nailing everything that it needs to go with. 99% of the time you can't do that. Most hams can't, and so you have it in the shack, like I do here. Now, do you need one? There's a number of different thoughts on this. I've had a person tell me that it's absolutely essential regardless of what you're doing. Not quite true. An antenna, if your antenna is a really broad band and you're working within that band, and your radio seeing an impedance that is your SWR is really low through all of it, and your impedance is around 50 ohms, really close to 50 ohms throughout the range of frequencies you're using, then no, you don't really need one. You can get away without it. However, most hams do, well, myself included, work at a vast array of frequencies and a vast array of bands. If you're going to do this and you don't have an antenna for each one that is resonant and of the right impedance for the frequencies that you're using, then you are going to need a tuner in order to make it work, because what is resonant on this frequency not necessarily be resonant over here, and what is a good 50 ohm impedance here is not going to be a good 50 ohm impedance on this frequency. So you're going to have that tuner in the middle to make it work. That's simple. If you're a lot of broadcast stations that are on just one frequency can get away without one, but most commercial broadcast stations you see have a tuner, even though they're only using one frequency. And a big part of that, I guess, is that because the antenna systems they're using present a mismatch no matter what, so they need the tuner to make it work. And so there you go. What is the purpose of the tuner? Well, one, it allows full power to be radiated by your antenna system. Two, it protects the radio in your transmitter. How does it do this? It stops the RF from getting back into the transceiver, which can cause damage if there's enough of it. It stops it from getting back into the transceiver and instead reflects it back to the antenna, and back and forth, like I said earlier. Now, I'm going to put a graphic up of just a very basic antenna tuner circuit, so you'll see what I'm talking about. That it's taking a mismatch system through a variable capacitor, transformer, and variable capacitor again, and so it can be adjusted for different bands and different frequencies. And that's what your radio sees. The radio sees what the tuner has presented the radio, automatic 50 ohms, and then will allow the power through and transforms that transformer will then allow it to go out through the mismatched feed line and antenna system. Very simple layman's way of putting it, but let's face it, this show and Ham Talk is not about going into depth about a lot of scientific principle and a lot of electronic theory. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of Ham Talk, one, is to help you set your station up on a tight budget, and to give you what you need to know to do it, not to bog you down with a lot of the theory and so on and so forth. So I try to present it in a very simple layman's terms so that the average Joe can understand it. Plain and simple. That's what it's all about. So, one, does an antenna tuner lie to your radio? Yeah, yes and no. I stand by yes it does, and the fact that it tells your radio that your system is at 50 ohms. They know because it actually is presenting the radio at 50 ohms itself, and so it's not in that aspect, because the radio is seeing a 50 ohm when the tuner does present 50 ohms. Does it protect your radio? Yes, it does. Should you have one? If you're using a range of frequencies and a range of bands, you definitely should have one, unless you have an antenna for each separate band that is resonant or really close to 50 ohms on all the frequencies you're using, which is almost a never happen. But there are cases where you can get away without it. Now, excuse me. This is also where we get into different feed lines. There are many different feed lines out there. There's balanced, which is twin lead, ladder line, so on and so forth. There's unbalanced. Coaxial cable is unbalanced. And do you need a balun for that? Some people say yes, some people say no. And the basic of it is this. I have seen dipoles that are cut to resonance perfect, and if it's done in such a way that the antenna itself is presenting a 50 ohm impedance, the feed line is 50 ohm feed line, then no, you really don't. This is, again, my opinion from experience and from practice and from what I've seen and done. However, having said that, a balun itself, if you're going from balanced to unbalanced, should you have it? You should. Plain and simply, you should. Do you need it? Depends on the antenna, depends on the feed line. What is the difference between a balun and an un-un? A balun matches a balanced line, balanced to unbalanced. An un-un is unbalanced to unbalanced. And of course there are different ones with different ratios, so 4 to 1 balun, 9 to 1 balun, 1 to 1 balun. It depends on your antenna. Again, depends on the impedance and characteristics of your antenna system. We'll get into baluns and un-uns in another episode. But straight up, antenna tuners, are they an important part of your station? Yeah. If you're using a number of frequencies, they are important. If you're using a number of different bands, and they are important. And here's the proviso, if you don't have antennas that are cut on the right impedance and resonant on those frequencies, yes, they're very important. I've seen antennas built out of 2.5 inch copper pipe built out of that, which are amazingly broadband, and on the band itself that they're on, man, they don't, they have an SWR that is almost flat across the whole thing. They don't need a tuner. But let's face it, 99.9 times out of 100, you're not going to be making an antenna out of 2-inch copper pipe. It's going to be wire, or it's going to be a commercially available antenna, which is not going to be that broadbanded. So yes, you're going to need one in that case. So anyhow, now you got the bare gist of it, the layman's terms of it. With that, I'll say 7-3. Have a great day, and we'll see you again on the next episode. This is Charlie, Sterling the Wonder Dog, and Miss Tina saying 7-3 for now. Have a great day. Bye.